Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and members of the press. On behalf of Rupa Publications India and ICRIR, I extend a very warm welcome to each one of you to the launch of Backstage, the story behind India's high growth years by Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable former Prime Minister of India, Dr. Manmohan Singh. It is a privilege to have you amongst us. Our esteemed panel for the evening, Mr. P. Chidambaram, Dr. Vivek Debroy, Mr. Y.V. Reddy, and Mr. Rajdeep Sardesai, who will be moderating the discussion this evening. I'd now like to invite Mr. Kapish Mehra, Managing Director, Rupa Publications, for the publisher's address.
Thank you, Vasundhara. A very good evening, first of all, to the Honorable former Prime Minister, Dr. Singh, the distinguished panelists who shall grace the stage in a bit, the bridegroom of the evening, Dr. Ahluwalia, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is sometimes difficult at a book launch like this to decide whom to address individually and whom not to. When you have a galaxy of stars all spread across this auditorium, one has to seek forgiveness and address everybody in a generic manner. My apologies for that. Today, ladies and gentlemen, is a special occasion because this is not just the publication of a book. This is not an author coming together and penning down his memoirs. And this certainly isn't just the economic history of India. This is Project Backstage. And this is authored by Ahluwalia and Company. And not the tire manufacturers, but the ones who've dominated economics for a few decades in the last many years. While the cover of the book does say Montek Ahluwalia, I must admit there is so much more than what meets the eye. Because, ladies and gentlemen, my job at these book launches is fairly simple. I am supposed to be essentially doing only three things. I'm essentially supposed to be talking very highly about the author. I'm supposed to be talking very highly about the book. And I'm supposed to be asking all of you to buy a copy or two on the way out. And I will do exactly that. Talking very highly about the author and the book is actually very simple. This book wouldn't have happened had the UPA not come together. And in my parlance, UPA is not what you all refer to. In my parlance, the real UPA is Ahluwalia and Company. The husband, the wife, the sons, the daughter-in-laws, the grandsons. It is everybody put together, the United Ahluwalia Alliance, which brought this book together. If Sir put words to paper, it is the spirit that was put into him by none other than ma'am. If this is about Backstage, then this is about ma'am. Like they say, the characters on the stage only play a certain part. The ones who really hold the strings are the ones who are backstage. And ladies and gentlemen, the one who really needs another round of applause is Mrs. Ahluwalia for the role in Backstage. Well, now with the niceties out of the way and gaining some brownie points of the family, I must tell you that it has been an outstanding experience. An experience which one as a publisher one would cherish and certainly try and use for every possible book. The attention to detail, the perfectionism in everything, the multiple cover options, the layout of the text, the many rounds of proofreading and fact check. If any of this was possible, it was because the author was somebody who wanted to get it right each time, every time. it's something one learns when one interacts with a person with the experience that Dr. Montek Ahluwalia has. And it's a privilege when one gets such an experience. For it is not very often that one walks into a household as a publisher and comes out as a foster son. So thank you for the love, affection that the Ahluwalias has bestowed on us. Suddenly, the Ahluwalia household has become a place where we don't ring a bell, we don't ask anybody, we just walk upstairs and say, here's the proof. So thanks for giving us that opportunity. This wouldn't have been possible if you hadn't extended that warmth, affection, as well as given us this space. Having said so and taking more than 3 minutes, which was my scheduled time as per today's program, I would have to talk very highly about the book. Being the publisher and having invested in the project, it's fairly easy. But because this is about an economist, this is about an administrator, it is also important to showcase how well the book has done by numbers. Words wouldn't do justice. So the easy answer is, normally in India, for people who have written would understand this, hardcovers are the premium category. It is rare that a hardcover book sells out its first print run before the release of the book in the market or a release function. I am grateful to the thoughtful economics of Montek Ahluwalia that this book has sold out the first print run at the launch itself and that we have to go in for a reprint. Thank you for making the economics work, sir. Once again, I'm grateful to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for making time on a Wednesday evening. This is really a special moment, and this wouldn't have been so special without all of you. Thank you once again, and don't forget to buy a book.
Thank you, Mr. Mehra. I'd now like to invite Dr. Rajat Kathuria, Director, CEO, ICRIER, to say a few words, please.
Thank you, Vasundhara. I completely echo whatever Kapish said and more. Good evening, everybody. Honorable former Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, other distinguished participants on the dais, and author of Backstage, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. I'm really delighted to extend, on ICRIER's behalf, a warm welcome to all of you and to the incredibly distinguished audience present here. It really is a privilege for us in ICRIER to be co-hosting this launch for at least 2 reasons, and many of you will be aware of those 2 reasons. The first is that Dr. Manmohan Singh, who is widely regarded as and acknowledged in the book as the architect of India's Big Bang economic reform of 1991, is a founder member of ICRIER. And so is the author of the book, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, and they both continue to inspire a lot of the research work that we do in ICRIER. So thank you very much. The second reason is that many of the topics that have been covered in the book by Montek are areas of current research in ICRIER, and these include telecom policy, which is in the news today, G20, the financial sector, infrastructure, PPPs, the political economy of reforms, banking and financial reforms, inclusion, trade, WTO, and global value chains. All of these are research interests in ICRIER, and we're so happy that Montek has covered all of this in his book. An opportunity to host such an event comes rarely, and when ICRIER was offered this opportunity, I grabbed it with both hands. And one last word. Montek acknowledges that the book would never have been written but for Isha's constant encouragement and intellectual support. It's in the preface. If you read the dedication, it's there. And let me say, this is with all humility, with all sincerity, that ICRIER owes a lot of its current standing in the think tank firmament to the constant support and encouragement from Isha, keeping alive the dream that was once dreamt by the founder-director, Sri K. Bilal. Ladies and gentlemen, I know this is going to be an evening with lots of treats, so I don't want to stand between you and the book and the discussion that follows. But ICREER is really, really proud with Rupa in bringing this treat to you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kathuria. Our next speaker is Mr. Sarwar Latif. He is Mr. Ahluwalia's oldest friend from his St. Stephen days, and who better than him to introduce our author this evening, Mr. Latif.
Dr. Manmohan Singh, Montague, Nisha, distinguished panelists and friends. I'm honored to have been asked to introduce Montague at this launch of his book. Since the roles he played in government are well known, I will focus briefly on his younger days and then talk a bit about his contribution to the transformation of India's economy. Montague and I have been close friends for 6 decades. We first met when he joined St. Stephen's College to read economics. I was also an economics honours student, having joined the previous year. We had much else in common. Montague had spent his childhood in Secunderabad, the twin city of my hometown, Hyderabad, although our paths never crossed in those years. Our mothers were among the first generation of Indian women in their respective families to graduate from a university. Our parents were making financial sacrifices to ensure that we got a good education. And we were part of that generation of Indians, born a few years before independence, who shared the excitement of a free India, in which we believed opportunities were open to us if we wished to seize them, and in whom the seeds of the idea of India had been firmly planted. Montague shared my interest in writing and joined the editorial board of Cooler Talk, a satirical broadsheet we started named after the college water cooler, where we often gathered to kill time. He went on to edit the Stephanian and represented the college in various debates across the country. His fellow students found it puzzling that he was never seen studying and yet kept topping the grades in every exam he took. So no one was surprised when he won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford or was selected for the World Bank's Young Professional Program in late 1968. He and Isha met in Washington, got married, and pursued very successful careers at the Bretton Woods institutions. However, they were always very keen to return to India. So it was not surprising when they took the plunge and came home in '79. We remained in close touch, although we were not always on the same continent. Montague dedicates his book to Isha, as was just noted, who he appropriately describes as a life partner and companion. Both Shahida and I have always been in awe of this amazing partnership, and I can personally vouch for the fact that this book is a great example of it. Montague's role as a reformer is what I will turn to next. But much of today's discussion may well focus on Montague's analysis of what the UPA government did or did not achieve in its 2 terms in office, and the role this has played in the situation the country currently faces. However, equally important is his gripping insider account of what it took to push forward economic reforms in the 1990s. The process Montague describes is an apt illustration of the Albert Hirschman thesis that it is not possible to solve all problems at once. This is due to constraints imposed inter alia by capacity and political economy. But as Elliman points out, small successes create forward and backward linkages that foster learning and change. And when these seeds are broadcast more widely, they break down the paralyzing belief that nothing can be done. This in turn fuels broader initiatives that take the early wins as their benchmark. One thing leads to another. Montague was part of an impressive group of reformers under Dr. Manmohan Singh's leadership, who were part of this process of learning and change and played a significant leadership role. This book lucidly describes this process of small changes leading to big outcomes and creating the thirst for more change. It's easy for those of us outside government to criticize the performance of those inside, But in the words of Theodore Roosevelt, the credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. So that this place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Montague, like several others, had the option of lucrative careers abroad or in the private sector, but chose to be in the arena. The transformation of India's economy owes much to people like him. I'm sure that those of you who get to read the book will find it illuminating and enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lateef. May I now request Dr. Manmohan Singh to kindly release the book. Please. I would now like to request Dr. Manmohan Singh to kindly say a few words.
Montague, Ishar, Chidambaramji, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Anyone who knows Montague recognizes that he is a brilliant economist and a very distinguished public sector in our country. I therefore am very happy to associate myself with today's function because I make some claim to having introduced Montague to the government system way back in 1970s. Of course, there are other people also. Bimal Jalan happens to be there. So, what should I say? Everyone knows Montague's virtuous path that he has taken and the offices that he has held in our government system. But there is one thing which I do wish to mention. It is often said that behind every successful man there is a powerful woman. And in this particular case, everyone also recognizes that Ishar is that one woman who Montague's career path is well known. I don't want to talk about his days as St. Stephen's student, But I do know that Montague, when he was at Oxford, he got a distinguished first, congratulatory first in the PPE. He was the president of the Oxford Union, and from there he went on to the World Bank. At the age of 28, he became the chief of the Income Distribution Division in the World Bank. And during that period, along with Professor Hollis Chenery, he wrote a very influential book, Redistribution with Growth, which signified the policy direction that Mr. McNamara, the then World Bank chairman, wanted to give to the work of the World Bank. And from there on to the Government of India is a well-known story. I tried to persuade Montague to come back to India, and he and Escher thought about it. And when I broached this subject with them in Washington, they asked me what are the facilities that will be available. And I wanted to make absolutely clear that I was not promising them anything except their love for their country. And that's how Montague's whole career path has been characterized by love for his country. And it has been a privilege for me to work with Montague, and he and Shri P. Chidambaram, if they were not there at the crucial time in 91 in the Ministry of Commerce, the story of the reforms could not have been as favorable as it turned out to be. So it's a great day that Montague is going to be felicitated by a person of the stature of Shri P. Chidambaram in the form of a discussion panelist. Otherwise, also, when the reform period is written, I don't know what the official narrative will be, but I for one know that it was a very tortuous path, because the dominant opinion then was not in favor of reforms. In the business community, there was Bombay Club, which was formed to see that India does not move on the path of liberalization. But I also knew that we had very limited time. And that time was not more than 1 month. And that's what I set out to do, that within 10 days of coming into office, I forced the government of India to agree to devalue the rupee. And that was a difficult decision. There were several people advising the then Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao not to go that path. That included the then President of India. And when I went to call on the President, he asked me, why are you taking this reckless path? And he said, you represent a government which has not sought a vote of confidence. And how can you take such important decision without a vote of confidence? I had to tell President Venkataraman that, Mr. President, if we wait for the vote of confidence, I may have nothing to sell to the world about India's story. And it must be said to the credit of Prime Minister Narasimha Rao that he stood by me. But even he had some doubts. I had got his approval to devalue the rupee in 2 stages. And when the first stage was over, some people went to the Prime Minister and tried to persuade him not to go ahead with the second step. And Prime Minister did mention to me, he rang me up, he said, "You will not take the second step in the 2-step devaluation." That upset me, but I had to obey the decision of the Prime Minister. I rang up the Governor of the Reserve Bank and told him what the Prime Minister wanted. But the Governor, the Deputy Governor in charge, he said to me, "Whether you like it or not, but I have also already shot the bull." So if that thing had not happened, once again the story of the reform process would have been very different. And I, for one, am very grateful to Prime Minister Narasimha Rao that he stood by me. But I am also very grateful to Montague, to Chidambaramji, to the Governor and the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, who stood by me firmly so that we could carry out the reform process in the manner in which we wanted to do. And therefore, Montague's role in the reform exercise is something which I am sure will be written in golden words. Even before he came to the Ministry of Finance, when he was in the Prime Minister's office as Additional Secretary, he had prepared a paper on liberalization of trade and industrial policy, which was very influential, and we took advantage of that paper to write a new pathway for reforms in our country. That was the time when our reserves were no more than 2 weeks, when no country was willing to lend us any money, and we had to mortgage our gold from the Reserve Bank in order to raise a loan of $500 million. From that stage, we brought this country out to a new pathway of courage, of confidence, and in that process, Montague's role was quite, I would say, excellent, because before I made him Finance Secretary, the officials in the Ministry of Finance were not in favor of the reform process. And I had to tell them that, gentlemen, if you do not agree with what we plan to do, for God's sakes, go. We will give you other rewarding positions, but we are determined to carry out the reform the way we intended. And I brought Montague to the Ministry of Finance as Finance Secretary, first as Economic Affairs Secretary, then as Finance Secretary, and he played an outstanding role in providing new leadership of courage, of innovation to the whole process of reform. So I thank Montague for what he did for India in '91, but he continued to do the same thing afterwards. When we were no longer in office, Mr. Chidambaram became the finance minister under the United Front government. Then came Mr. Yashwant Sinha. Montague stayed on in the finance and provided that sense of continuity, and also the support that he got from Mr. Chidambaram and Mr. Yashwant Sinha. I think that was also a shining chapter in the economic history of our country, how continuity in policy making sometimes convinces investors that India is a saleable proposition, bankable proposition. Subsequently, Montague went from finance to the Planning Commission, and from Planning Commission he again went back to the IMF, where the fund had set up an independent evaluation officer. Director's post was falling vacant. Montague was chosen for that position, and he went and joined the IMF. And then when the UPA came to office, I could think of no other person better than Montague to take charge of the Planning Commission. And the 10 years that he spent as the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, he played a transformatory role in giving the Planning Commission a new sense of direction, of innovation, of creative thinking, and that is the reason why India saw a sharp increase in growth rate from the first 7 months, for the first 7 years of the UPA saw the growth rate of over 8.5%. The two last years there was a downturn, but there also, when we left office, the path was again the upward direction, and in 1913-14 the economy was growing at the rate of 6%. But the important thing is that at a time when the world financial system was collapsing under the weight of the Lehman process, India managed to escape that ill effect of financial crisis. We escaped, and that also is due to Mr. Chidambaram. That also is due to Montague's giant exercise in ensuring that our economy does not collapse under the weight of the international financial crisis. So, Montague has written about all these matters, the good points, the weak points of the UPA government. I think these issues will be debated, and they should be debated, because we have today a government which does not acknowledge that there is such a word as slowdown. And I think this is not good for our country. If you do not recognize the problems that you face, you're not likely to find credible answers to take corrective action. And that's a real danger. So therefore I believe Montague's books deals with all these points, and it will therefore be of great help to the future growth of our country. Montague has also pointed out that, contrary to what the ruling group may say, today the 5 trillion economy by 2024-25 is wishful thinking. Also, that there is a no reason to expect that 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 farmers' incomes can be doubled in 3 years period. And at the same time, he said, we must work for high rate of growth, and that 8% growth rate is feasible proposition. But it requires rethinking about the role of fiscal policy, fiscal development of the country. There's need for tax reforms in a much bolder way, because he said, as he points out, in our country, if you look at the real picture, the real fiscal deficit, center state combined, is as high as 9%, and that's not good for satisfying our ambitions of having a dynamic economy growing at the rate of 8 to 10%. Therefore, he ends up by advocating fiscal reforms, tax reforms, also increasing expenditure in directions in which it should be increased, that is infrastructure, health, education, defense, and all these activities require much greater attention than they have received in the past. So I do believe that I hope there will be a consensus among right-thinking persons about the path that Montague has identified for dealing with the economic situation in our country. With these words, I thank Montague for having written about the 10 years of the UPA. There will be question marks. There should be question marks. And I hope there will be a solid debate that will produce a better program for carrying the reform process further. I do believe that there is need for rethinking the reform process fresh. Second generation of reforms requires new pathways, and these new pathways can emerge only through solid discussion of the alternatives that our country faces and the challenges that our country faces. And I hope and trust that this book will provide that incentive element to facilitate the process of dialogue, the process of discussion about the future and the challenges that our country faces. So I thank Montague for having taken this trouble of writing this book. As I said, this is a collective effort, and I thank Isher for having egged Montague on to produce this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite the man of the evening, Mr. Montague Singh Ahluwalia, to say a few words.
Well, thank you everybody. You know, having written a book of about 417 pages, my instinct was that I really shouldn't have to say anything. And you're going to have a very exciting discussion by a very distinguished panel. But I do want to use this opportunity, first of all, to say thanks to Dr. Manmohan Singh, who, as he has himself said, was responsible for giving me all the opportunities that enabled me to participate in what has been a really exciting journey, and I've written about that journey. I also want to thank Isha, because as many people have pointed out, I mean, her role in my doing this was critical because she felt that this needed to be said. She participated in it. Having an economist partner is a great help in the sense that they can be quite critical and be willing to put you on the right path. And one of the major things that she always emphasized is you're not writing a government document anymore. So put in lighter stuff, put in personal touches. And I find that many of the people who've read the book have said things like, oh, I like that and I like this. And most of that is really the stuff that Isha was saying I should be doing more of. So thank you, Isha. And actually, I should say, she did this in very trying circumstances because in the last 2 or 3 months of writing of this book, she ran into a major health problem and then had to go through a pretty grueling radiation come chemo treatment. And even during that, she was contributing by being a critic on the last draft and saying this doesn't read properly, etc., etc. So I think her role in it, I've acknowledged that in the book, but I don't think that words can suffice to say what her contribution really has been. And of course, I thank all the panelists, my publisher, Rajat, for co-sponsoring this event. And on the book itself, let me just say one thing. It won't take more than 2 minutes. I've been struck by the fact that many journalists and so on have come and asked for the odd comment. And invariably, the focus is on what happened in the last 2 or 3 years of the UPA. And I keep telling them that, look, I have quite frankly admitted and stated that in the last 2 or 3 years, things went downhill. In the history of an economy, you have uphill movements and you get downhill movements. And of course, you need to study why that happened, and no doubt some of these issues will come up in the course of the discussion. But the book is not about the last 2 or 3 years. It's actually not even about just the UPA. It's really about a much longer journey of how economic policy in India evolved and how we shifted from an earlier, very control-oriented regime to a much more open regime. This was even before the 1991 reforms. This thinking had crept in and was being discussed. The 91 reforms, which you all know about, was a major change because it sort of really shifted the direction of policy. And a lot of what has happened now is the result of that change. But it wasn't just that the Narasimha Rao government with Dr. Manmohan Singh sort of structuring the reforms did everything. I mean, the fact is that reforms were pursued by a succession of governments. The United Front government, which had Prime Minister Deve Gowda and then Prime Minister Inder Gujral, and had Mr. Chidambaram as the finance minister, actually continued the reforms very substantially. They were only there for 2 years. They were followed by the Vajpayee government, the NDA government, and Prime Minister Vajpayee also brought in a substantial measure of continuity. I mean, the whole business of focusing on fiscal deficit reduction, reducing import duties, opening up to foreign direct investment, these are things that were actually continued in the 6 years of the Vajpayee government. And then, of course, you had the UPA, which had Dr. Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister, Finance Minister Chidambaram, and naturally that momentum actually continued. And I think it is in this period that you saw the 8+% growth for the first time. The main lesson I draw from this is that, economic policy change is a process that occurs over time. It's a process that needs to be supported by successive governments, and each government ought to build on what has been achieved by previous governments. And it's also something that involves a large number of people. I mean, Dr. Manmohan Singh has been very kind by mentioning me, but honestly, when I look back, there were a large number of people contributing to the reforms. C. Rangarajan, Dr. Bimal Jalan, who's sitting here, Mr. N.K. Singh, who's sitting here, several others, and I won't mention them all, but they, at critical times, pushed the reforms forward. And I think in the UPA, we brought in a lot of people from outside. I mean, you had Raghuram Rajan, who came in from outside. You had Nandan Nilekani, who was brought in from the private sector. And actually, a modern economy is much more complex. In a way, the 1991 challenge was simpler. The economy was relatively simpler, and the challenge was simpler. We're now running a much more complex economy, interacting with the world. We need a policy framework which is open to fresh thinking, get in inputs from outside, evaluate them, and then see how we can move forward. Right now, there is a lot of despair, because clearly the growth rate is very low. We're going to end the year with less than 5%. It's unlikely that it'll go much above 5% next year. And compared to the targets that we have set, I mean, you know, the $5 trillion target requires a 9% growth rate in real terms. Compared to those targets, we're nowhere there. But at the same time, I look back. I mean, the situation was pretty bad in 1979. It was pretty bad in 1990. But the economy was brought around. So I think this economy has the capacity to respond, providing we put in place the kind of policies that would allow that response to take place. And there's enough expertise in the country to know what needs to be done. We just have to bring the expertise together and listen to them. And I think you need a more open process so that you can internalize areas which, frankly, are crucial, but most people didn't know about them even 3 or 4 years ago. For example, the challenge of the digital economy. I mean, anybody who looks back on his work experience, unless they've been deep into it in the last 3 years, they frankly haven't got a clue. I mean, in my own case, I can tell you that my grandson, who's 10 years old, knows more about the digital economy and my smartphone than I do. And it's really important that people should know what it is that we are dealing with, how the world has changed, and how do we shape policy to accommodate that change. Looking at the problem through the prisms of 10 years or 15 years ago is really not going to solve it. Anyway, I don't want to stand any more between the audience and the panel. So let me just say thank you, and thank you to all of you who have come here in such large numbers to make this a truly memorable event for me. Thank you.